you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to hear about all your experiences in the coffee industry. As you know, and as we've spoken before, it's an industry that I'm really interested in. And I would love for us to be able to share as much as we possibly can with the viewers, just to give them an idea of what the industry is like. And as well as that, just to kind of let people know about, what industries that they could potentially get into. So if you can take it away from me and just let me know a little bit about yourself and about how you came to start writing about the coffee industry.
Yeah, sure. So hi, I'm happy to be here. So really, I kind of fell into coffee and writing about it. It was all just a series of coincidences. So I was working already a lot in the international development landscape, and mostly in the agricultural sector and agribusiness. And so a big commodity that I was working on was coffee. So I was already, I was doing communication for that sector. So I was already introduced to the coffee sector and sort of issues related to climate change, issues that coffee farmers often find themselves confronted with. So I had quite a good knowledge of the production side of things already, and also trade. And then I started, so I'm also a writer, and I just saw an ad for Perfect Daily Grind. They were looking for writers. And I thought, well, I know about the production side of coffee. So I basically reached out to them, and it's been a really good collaboration ever since. And I'm staff writer for Perfect Daily Grind, which is an online publication for all things coffee. And it's a really nice platform because it has something for everyone, for producers, for traders, for coffee shop owners, for roasters, and just generally for people who are into coffee. So and then over time and doing research for articles, I just really got into coffee and more as well on the roasting side, and more or less.
Most people drink coffee or have at least tasted coffee. So what would you say are the different types of coffee that actually exist out there?
So, there are different ways of answering this question, but I would say, first of all, the main thing is that there are two main commercialized species of coffee, and that's Arabica and what we know as Robusta. But the correct name is actually coffeeghana. But generally, in the industry and it's generally known as Robusta. So just in brief, because it's quite a vast topic, but Arabica is really what you would find for the higher quality coffees, let's say, especially in specialty coffee, and it's probably what most of us drink. Robusta has a much higher caffeine content and is usually used for more commercial purposes and generally considered to be lower quality. It's often used for soluble coffees, which means that it still has a large share of the market because commercial coffees and soluble coffee has a large share of the market. So but this is something that's changing, and I can talk a bit more about that later. But Robusta isn't necessarily bad quality, and this is being increasingly recognized. But more or less, you have Arabica, Robusta, and you also have Liberica, which is another species, which is rarer for now, but slowly gaining interest and recognition. We may see more of that in coming years.
Okay.
Another way to look at that question is that there are three quality segments. You've got your commercial, more standard quality, like supermarket coffees, soluble coffees. Then you have a more premium quality segment, maybe looking at like Lavazza, Illy, Nespresso, where it's still commercial, but there's more focus on quality and sustainability. And then you have the specialty segment, which is much smaller share of the market, and it's really focused on quality. So you have that, and then finally, you can buy coffee in different forms. So you have your green beans, so when they're not roasted. You have your roasted beans. You can buy it roasted and ground, which is what most people do for filter coffee. And then you've got your soluble and your coffee pods, etc. So that's more or less different ways of answering the question.
Okay. What would you say is like your favorite brand of coffee if you had to select one?
That's a really difficult question, because there are so many out there. So I'll try to give a general reply and then give you a few examples. I mean, usually I pick my coffees based on origin, because I know what origins I like best, on quality and also on sustainability. So, you know, if it's fair trade or another similar scheme, and also environmentally sustainable. And I usually go for artisan roasters, so like smaller brands, you know, coffee shops where they roast their own coffee. So, I mean, I'll just give you a small selection, but I mean, it's really not everything I like. So I visited Ethiopia a lot, and I love Ethiopian coffee. I'm actually drinking one right now. It's Ethiopian Beauty.
Okay, lovely.
So in Ethiopia, there are some really nice roasters who, you know, produce their own coffee. So there's Galani Coffee, Garden of Coffee, where they actually roast by hand.
Wow.
And Ya Coffee Roasters. In Greece, where I live, I really like Taf Coffee. So Taf is basically the pioneer of third wave coffee in Greece.
Right.
In Ghana, I like Asili Coffee and Gold Coast Roasters.
Okay, lovely.
So they're really experimenting as well in specialty Robusta, which is really interesting. And then just a tip, because, you know, we don't necessarily always have access to, you know, super high quality artisan roasters. And if you're at the supermarket, I think a safe bet is always Illy. Like for me, Illy is, you know, it tastes good, it's good quality, and also it stays fresh because they have the added value of this really specialized packaging that keeps the coffee fresh for a really long time. So if you're at the supermarket, Illy for me is a really good choice.
Okay, lovely. And if I ask, how do you actually make your coffee, just out of curiosity?
So it depends. I have a really nice espresso machine. You know, and it's sort of, you know, it grinds the beans so that I have them ground fresh every time. I have all these different fancy settings. And I do use that a lot because I'm a big espresso drinker. But, you know, it's not necessary. I mean, I also really like using the mocha pot, you know, the Italian, like screw top.
Okay, right.
Pot, yeah. This is something that's really inexpensive, and it actually makes really good coffee. Plus it makes the house smell really good.
Okay.
And the other way I like to prepare coffee is with it's like a filter coffee with the oh god, what's it called? I've forgotten. Oh, I've just had a memory gap. But like basically
okay.
it's similar to V60, so like a V60 brewing method, which is basically a way of making filter coffee.
Okay. So how would you describe the pros and cons of the whole process of how coffee is made? So from like when it's kind of grown to when it's like produced and sold. If you give me like a little snapshot of how you would describe that, that'd be great.
Okay, so I mean, from a producer or a farmer perspective, coffee can be quite difficult. So first of all, it's quite a sensitive plant, especially Arabica. You know, it needs a lot of time and effort and care. It's not like, you know, I don't know, anyway, another crop that might be more straightforward. It has there are lots of different varieties, lots of different levels of quality, and everything that you do, whether it's from like, whether it's a farm level or a processing level, every single thing you do is going to change the final taste and quality. So It's pretty complex. So it's something that you need to invest a lot of time in. The thing for farmers and coffee producers is that, especially for established producing countries, it's not a matter of choice. Often they were born into it, and it's basically generations and generations of knowledge and experience. So it just makes sense that they should continue with that, because they know it so well, you know, from their parents and grandparents. So whether it's or not it's difficult, they don't know anything else. So, you know, they kind of have to stick with it. So, but that said, I think, so those are the kind of cons. Another big con is also price volatility. So the global market price of coffee is extremely volatile. It fluctuates all the time. It's kind of a moving target, and more often than not, the prices are low. So recent years have seen, you know, extremely low prices, which means that farmers really struggle to make a profit. And unfortunately, like any commodity, coffee is really, you know, coffee trade is really extractive. You know, it's the same story of buying the raw product cheap from producing countries that already have lower economies, and adding nearly all the value in the rich countries, in the consumer countries. So, you know, it does work in that kind of framework. But, you know, some things are changing, and I would say the pro is if there are good partnerships in place. So if the producers can find trusted buyers, you know, they know that they can sell large volumes at a fair price, and there's a good communication. Then, you know, both the producer and the buyer can evolve together over time. They can both achieve better qualities, you know, production level and consumer level. And ultimately, you know, they can both make a better profit. But that really depends on there being a really good partnership and communication in place, I would say. So, I mean, there's potential, and it's possible to do well, but definitely from a farmer perspective, because of the regional power asymmetries in place, it's pretty tough.
So Sarah, can you give me an example of like how coffee is actually grown? It'd be quite interesting to kind of hear about the different ways that that process kind of happens.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert. I'm a writer in communication, but I have worked enough in the sector to kind of get an idea. So basically, first I would define the different types of growers. So, you know, there are smallholder farmers, which is something that's very typical in Africa. So it's like lots of little small plots of land, and it's usually small farmers. It can almost be a garden, a coffee garden. I mean, we're thinking that small, and typically those small farms would be gathered into cooperatives or unions, you know, so that they can have better representation and kind of negotiation power. Then you have medium farms, so they might be slightly bigger, and that means that they can be individual and you know, have their own buyers. And then you have like large estate farms. So think Brazil, for example, which is the #1 coffee producer in the world. So they have, you know, huge expanses of farm growing coffee, and it's grown in a very different way there. You know, in the small farms in Africa, for example, in Ethiopia, it's all grown very organically alongside other crops. You know, it's shade grown. There's very little use of fertilizers, because in any case, they don't have the finance to buy inputs or fertilizers. So by default, they grow organically. But in Brazil, because they have these huge farms, and it's not shade grown, you know, it's all kind of it's so that they can cultivate large volumes of coffee. And there, you know, it's a lot more mechanized, so they have lots of machines and fertilizers, and you know, it's a totally different game. So those are the different ways. And I mean, generally it's basically, you know, you start with a seedling, and then the coffee grows on trees, and then the ripe cherries are harvested, and then these are either sun dried or washed. There are two ways of processing them. And then the green beans are kind of spread on drying beds, and then there's another kind of sorting and processing phase until they're ready for export.
Okay. And how long does it usually take for this to kind of happen, just on average?
So it depends on the variety, of course, but typically a coffee tree would take about 3 or 4 years to bear fruit. Like a newly planted coffee tree would take around 3 or 4 years to bear fruit. And then it's just a question of waiting for the cherry to ripen. And typically there might be 1 or 2 harvests a year, generally.
Okay, that's great. And I know you said that you're not an expert in coffee in Ghana, but it would be interesting to know what you do know, because as I've mentioned, like I'm a novice at this, so it'd be really great to kind of hear what your knowledge is so far.
Yeah, so no, I'm definitely not an expert on coffee in general or on Ghanaian coffee, but I do have some knowledge, and I have visited Ghana, and I love it. And I mean, generally, so Ghana is mostly known for its cocoa. It's the second largest cocoa exporter in the world, and it's mostly recognized for that. It does have a history of growing coffee, but that was way back, and it was kind of abandoned. So you do find some abandoned coffee plantations in Ghana, and they're trying to kind of revive those now. Generally, Ghana has lower elevations. So Ghanaian mountains are much lower than those, for example, in Ethiopia or in Colombia or Kenya, where typically you'll get these high elevation Arabicas that are kind of prized for their quality. So Ghana works with much lower altitudes, and that means that typically they'll be producing Robusta coffee species, which grows in warmer climates and lower altitude. I mean, just to give you an idea, Ghana only reaches about 400 meters above sea level, and for a good quality Arabica, I mean, basically the best Arabicas in the world are grown at like 1,200 and beyond meters above sea level. So there's a big difference. There is this theory, you know, that the higher the altitude, the better the quality. And while that does generally apply, you know, it's not so straightforward. And also, you know, the narrative is changing. Robusta doesn't necessarily mean lower quality, and there are ways to kind of experiment with it and make it better quality. So, I mean, in recent years, Ghana has been kind of reinvesting into its coffee sector and seeing that there's some potential there. And I mean, Robusta can be really commercially viable because there's a big demand for it. So they're reinvesting into their coffee infrastructure, trying to revive the plantations, and some entrepreneurs are investing in research and development on Robusta and like ways to produce better qualities that can get better prices, basically. So, you know, things are starting to change, plus climate change is a big factor that's going to shape the narrative for Ghana's coffee scene, because being a Robusta producer, I mean, with climate change that requires high elevations and low temperatures, it's becoming harder and harder to have enough arable land to produce it. So people are starting to look at hybrids, Arabica hybrids that are more resistant and that don't require such high elevations. But apart from that, people are also turning to Robusta, which is basically much more resilient. It's less prone to diseases, and it can grow at lower altitudes, which is all really interesting in the face of climate change. So all these things are things that Ghana has going for it. But, you know, for production at scale, you need a lot of work. And at the moment, I don't think that Ghana has really the infrastructure or the governance policies or trade policies in place to support a production at scale. But this is something that can change, you know, with the right motivation.
Okay. And actually, I was going to ask as well about the coffee culture in Ghana. Just from my experience, Ghanaians love tea. And I just wondered, just from like your research, what have you found out about the change in culture, or if there needs to be a change in culture, and any kind of, I guess, examples that you have of culture changing to make people more lovers of coffee?
Mm. Yeah, so Ghana definitely is a more tea drinking country. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that is linked to its history with British colonialism. I visited Ghana, as I said, but I've never actually lived there. So what I'm going to tell you is based on what I observed while I was there, and also from my discussions with Ghanaians about on the topic. So I have been told that there's a kind of this folklore around coffee there, that it's bad for your health. And this is really damaging to any potential coffee consumption in Ghana. You know, if people think it's bad for you, you know, in the same way that like cigarettes are, then of course they're not going to be on board with buying it. While I was there, I noticed that whenever there is coffee on offer, it's usually like cheap, soluble stuff, you know, like Nescafe or something, like instant coffee. So I think coffee there is more associated with, you know, kind of waking up or getting that kick that you need to get through your work day. It's less associated with like enjoying a warm drink and comfort, you know. I think this is what they use tea for. So I think that if coffee consumption is to take off in Ghana, there needs to be a huge work of education. So, you know, teaching people that coffee isn't bad for your health, that it can taste really good. You need to educate people's palates as well, because coffee is something has quite a unique taste, and it can taste kind of bitter. So, you know, people's palates need to be kind of trained for them to really appreciate the complexities and the qualities that exist. But a really big one for me is that if it's to take off, it really needs to be associated with social interaction. You know, it needs to be put at the heart of social gatherings. I mean, Ghanaians are like very sociable people, and they love big gatherings, and social interaction is really important to them. So I think that if coffee can play a part in that, that would be the best way for it to really take off. And plus, I think another thing that might work is kind of taking pride in something that's Ghana grown, Ghana roasted. Like if there were roasted coffees that were completely made in Ghana, produced, roasted, I think that Ghanaians would probably be happy to play a part in that and to invest in that, basically.
Okay, that sounds great. And just wondering, in terms of like the coffee growers, what kinds of people or what kind of motivations would get people to grow coffee?
So as I mentioned before, for me, the different kinds of growers are like, there'll be the more commercial ones that are basically focused on producing large quantities that just meet commercial grade standards. And that will be typically for, you know, more supermarket coffees, you know, like Jacobs, or for instant coffee, you know, with Robusta. And then you have some growers who try to combine, they might have their commercial coffees that they export, but they might also cater to the specialty market. This is because it will give them a better reputation, you know, if they're seen to be able to cater to higher quality standards. And, you know, of course they can charge a higher price for it, but to be honest, the volumes are a lot smaller, you know, than with commercial. It's not necessarily, there's not necessarily much return on investment for specialty for coffee farmers. They usually need to combine it also with commercial coffees. Yeah, I would say that generally another way of defining the types of growers is that you'll have your established coffee producing countries, you know, like in Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, or in Central and Latin America, you know, Colombia, Honduras. These are countries that are really have an established history of coffee production. But now you're seeing new countries pop up, you know, starting or rekindling their coffee production activities, like Ghana, for example. And I think the motivation there is just that basically there's such a high demand for coffee, and that's projected to grow in the next 10, 20 years. It's not something that's going to stop. People will always drink coffee, and demand, if anything, is getting higher and higher. So of course, this is like the main motivation. It's like people are recognizing that there is a demand and they're finding ways to meet that demand. I think that would be the main motivation.
Okay, so as coffee is like a re-emerging market in terms of what Ghana would usually, I guess, sell and grow, cocoa obviously has been more predominant. What do you think would be like the selling point or the point at where people would focus more on coffee than they would cocoa? Do you think that's possible?
So I don't think, for Ghana, I don't think it's a case of choosing between coffee or cocoa. I think that cocoa is so well established, and the cocoa that Ghana produces is so amazing that there's no reason that they should have to choose. I think it will always remain at the heart of their exports and of their economy. But I do think that it would be a smart move for them to diversify. So, and that's what they're recognizing now increasingly. So, you know, they need to diversify risk, they need to diversify crops, they need to diversify products in order to be more resilient, to have a more resilient production and a more resilient economy. You know, it's basically a case of not putting all your eggs in one basket, you know, because if you only rely on cocoa, or if you only rely on one commodity, you become a lot more vulnerable, because if something happens, either, you know, in terms of market prices or in terms of pests and diseases, you know, then you're left with nothing. So it's always good to have a backup plan. And I think coffee could be that if it's done in the right way. And, you know, it's not just about diversifying the crops, but it's also about diversifying the products. So at the moment, Ghana mostly exports raw cocoa beans, but, you know, increasingly they're looking at processing it in country and making chocolate at origin. And it's the same for the coffee, you know, if they don't necessarily only have to export the green beans, you know, they could look at roasted coffee roasted at origin for the domestic or regional market as well. So yeah, I would say that it's basically about a kind of risk management strategy.
So do you think that there's an issue with sustainability in terms of how coffee is, I guess, grown and produced? And how would you say, like, are there things happening at the moment to kind of improve sustainability with coffee?
So, I mean, I wouldn't link it specifically to coffee or Robusta, the sustainability actions. I mean, sustainability is basically on everyone's agenda at the moment. It's something that we can't avoid anymore. We need to be more environmentally and socially sustainable. And that basically means taking better care of the environment, you know, where the coffee grows, and also taking better care of the people who grow it, you know, giving them a fair price, making sure they have a living income, you know, making sure that it's gender inclusive. These are all things that are part of what we call being sustainable. And I'm explaining that because sustainable has really become a kind of buzzword and people don't necessarily really know what it means. But it's basically about that. It's about recognizing that the land gives to us and that our farmers give to us. And it's basically about making sure that they can continue giving to us in the long term by taking better care of them. So yeah, I mean, for coffee specifically, some actionable ways, basically using more sustainable agricultural practices, so making sure that they're kind of water and energy efficient, that they contribute to climate change mitigation, you know, with carbon capture, and perhaps at processing level, again, making sure it's water efficient, making sure that it's that there's some kind of good waste management system in place, and yeah, basically, you know, looking at recycling, not being wasteful, and just generally being more efficient.
Okay, so if I could ask, what exactly is a coffee ecosystem?
So a coffee ecosystem, this was actually a term that I picked up from Philippe Montagnon from CIRAD, which is a French agricultural research body. And he told me about a coffee ecosystem, which it's a really nice concept. So basically, a coffee ecosystem is for a coffee producer, is all the providers, all the players that will help them ultimately have a good quality and successful coffee crop. So that could be, for example, having nurseries, so for coffee seedlings, so having nurseries available, having access to fertilizers, which is something that's not so simple because they can be expensive, and you know, in African countries it's not always easy to access fertilizers. Having some kind of support for disease management, so you know, advisors, basically I don't know, organizations in place who can support farmers with disease management, organizations and support in place for phytosanitary measures, kind of research organizations for soil analysis. So basically, so the farmer can go to those people and say, kind of give a soil sample and say, okay, what should I plant here? You know, there are all these different varieties. Some grow better in some places than others. And then, of course, the whole advice, all the advice players. So like, this is more related to government extension services or private extension services, technical assistance for matters of trade, things like that. And then finally, agricultural research and development. So these are all things that, for example, in Brazil, they have an excellent ecosystem, and that's why they do so well. They have all these things available and they can just produce the best coffee in the best conditions. But you know, other countries, and I keep mentioning Africa, but it's less organized, there are less funds, and basically there are more gaps in the coffee ecosystem, which makes it harder for farmers to produce coffee.
So could you explain to me what the coffee supply chain is?
Yeah, so the coffee supply chain is basically the chain of players that you would typically have for coffee production from seed to cup. So at the bottom of the chain, or at the beginning of the chain, however you want to put it, you'll have the producers or farmers. Then you'll have the processors. So these are basically the wet or dry mills. So we're still at origin here. We're still at the country of origin. Then you have the exporters in the country of origin. So these are the traders who have the network and the the infrastructure to export the coffee to consumer countries. Then you have the importers who are based in the consumer countries who are bringing the coffee into the consumer countries. And then you have the roasters who roast the green coffee. You have the marketing services, all the packaging, etc. And then you have the distribution, which is basically supermarkets, coffee shops, cafes, restaurants, and hotels. So basically that's it. That's really the supply chain from seed to cup.
Okay, great. So what kind of support is there in Ghana for this industry at the moment?
So as I mentioned earlier, Ghana used to produce coffee a long time ago, and they stopped, and now they're kind of trying to revamp their coffee and specifically their Robusta industry. And Ghana's government is really committed to reviving that coffee industry. And in 2010, there was the Coffee Development Project, where they invested $2.8 million in the coffee sector, which really shows a commitment to reviving the coffee industry. And recently, there was the creation of the Coffee Federation of Ghana, which is another important milestone because, when organizations are formed and players come together, that's when you really start to see change because, there's more power in numbers. They start gathering key stakeholders and there's more space to kind of create new regulations, influence policy making, etc. So this is something else that's happening, and I think that the Ghana Cocoa Board, so Cocoa Board, is also involved and kind of in partnership and lending support. So yeah, I mean, there are different things happening in Ghana at policymaking level that should enable in the next years or decades a good revival of Ghana's coffee production sector.
I've noticed a new wave of African countries taking pride in their culture within the diaspora and wanting to buy African grown products to support each other. And I think you've mentioned that earlier. Is this something that you say, you've noticed? Can you go into a little bit more detail for me?
Yeah. So this is something that's been happening over the last few years. And it's something that's been even more reinforced now recently with Black Lives Matter, which has gone beyond just the US and supporting Black-owned businesses, but it's even it's gone further to supporting African economies and recognizing this power asymmetry and kind of unfair distribution of profit between countries in the south, so like more developing countries, and countries in the north, so like Europe and the US. So there's definitely been a lot more support for African products, both from the diaspora, but also from even US or European consumers. So you're seeing things pop up like Ghana made chocolates, Ethiopian coffee, Ethiopian leather, even Kenyan fashion and textiles. A lot of skincare products as well are doing really well because Africa has access to all these amazing plants that are great for skincare, like shea and even coconut oil. So there's a wealth of things there, and I think Africans are starting to say, okay, we have the source, of all these products. So why don't we make them ourselves? And, who knows them better, and who knows them better than the people who grow them to turn them into something amazing? And I think that there's a lot of support for that. And, it's really about not just about exporting raw commodities anymore. It's about adding value in country. It's about generating better profit, to contribute to national economies and basically grow. It's a lot about being a kind of new wave of entrepreneurs, I would say, who are like really motivated to change the narrative and position themselves equally on the global market.
So do you think there's anything else that Ghanaians can do to support kind of the coffee industry? So I don't know, for example, like buying cups of coffee when they're at home, or if they maybe order coffee, like, is there anything else that you would say that we could do to support more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a first step would be to try and, for Ghanaians to try and educate themselves on coffee if they don't know much about it. You know, and that doesn't necessarily have to be homework, you know, it can be fun. And I think that now with social media, it's something that comes a lot more naturally. You know, coffee is really associated to kind of it's at the heart of like the hip generation, you know. You see people, you know, drinking their coffee, you know, in the cafes with their laptops. So I think that for the next generation, coffee, they'll kind of turn more naturally to coffee because it's kind of part of what they see online, basically. But in terms of supporting specifically Ghanaian coffee, yeah, I would just look up what brands exist in country, and you know, going to the cafes, well, you know, if COVID permitting. Yeah, usually they, you know, a lot of them now, especially with COVID, they have online sales. So, you know, it's just looking them up and going online, and you can order the coffee. I think these are some good steps to start with.
Okay, so you mentioned some brands that you actually enjoy their coffee. What are some of the exciting things that these new brands are actually doing in Ghana at the moment?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece about Ghana's Robusta sector and the changes that are happening for Perfect Daily Grind, I think last year. And I had the opportunity to interview 3 coffee players in Ghana. So one was Cafe Magnifico, and they had a really interesting story of how they started and story of growth. And they offer some quality coffees. And what I like about them is that they make it quite accessible for people who aren't necessarily coffee drinkers, you know. So they offer, I think they have a range of soluble coffees, if I'm not mistaken. And they have some more accessible products. So it's not like, you know, thrown into the specialty deep end, which can be quite impressive sometimes, you know. Then there's a Silly Coffee. So this is a brand that I really respect, and they're doing some great things. And I think that they've had a few awards for being sort of visionaries or entrepreneurs. So I think that they produce their own coffee, so Robusta coffee. I think they grow it and roast it and sell it. And then they also have I think a range of like African coffees. So it might be a blend of coffees sourced from different African countries. And what I really like about them is that they're really strong on this sort of empowering Africa narrative. So they're all about really putting Africa on the coffee map. And then you have Gold Coast Roasters, who I've tried their coffees and I love them. And so they're all about really proving to the world that Robusta can be specialty. Robusta can taste good. Robusta can be high quality. You know, usually when people think of Robusta, they think because it has a very high caffeine content, it can sometimes taste like really strong and a little bit of like burnt rubber, which you don't want to be drinking. But you know, they're finding ways to experiment both at production level with the plants and also at with the roasting. And I tried one of their specialty Robustas and I was really surprised. It tasted really good. So these are the 3 that I know and that I would recommend.
Are there any like conferences or publications or people that we should be following to kind of keep up to date with the latest trends?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start with Perfect Daily Grind. That's the online coffee publication that I write for. But I'm not necessarily just promoting the the platform I work for. What I like about them is that while other publications are a lot more focused on one segment of the supply chain, so they might be more targeted at like coffee shops or roasters or Perfect Daily Grind is a lot more comprehensive, so it has something for everyone. It has really useful information and it's also categorized, so you can go straight to the articles that interest you. So it has a section for producers basically, with tips and anything from like how to manage climate change to how to improve your yield to anything at all. And they have that for roasters, for consumers. So yeah, I would say that that's a really good platform if people want to do any research. In terms of organizations and events and conferences, the Specialty Coffee Association is a big one, but that's really for specialty. And they have the World of Coffee events. Of course, now it's been disrupted with COVID, but usually they have one once a year. The Global Coffee Platform is another website that I would recommend. And for Africa, you have the African Fine Coffee Association. You have so it's French speaking, but the Conseil Interprofessionnel du Cacao et du Café. So they're for basically cocoa and coffee in Africa. And also they're called ACRAM, and they're the agency for Robusta coffee in Africa and Madagascar. So they're called ACRAM if you want to look them up. And they're specifically for Robusta in Africa. So that would be a good one. And finally, apart from working for Perfect Daily Grind, I also work for the United Nations International Trade Center, a program called Alliances for Action. And they do a lot of work on coffee and work a lot with coffee producers. So I would also look them up. And at the moment, I'm working on a coffee export guide, which should be released end of March. So it's basically just a book of information and guidelines and anything that you would need, whether you're a policymaker or a roaster or a producer or an exporter.
Wow, that sounds really exciting. I definitely need to read that. I trust that it'll be fabulous. So looking forward to that. So are there any kind of like little tips or any advice that you can give to people that might want to dive into the coffee business? Say, for example, if people are thinking about going to Ghana, purchasing some land, getting some farmers to work the land, what kind of advice would you give off the bat?
I think I would probably give the same advice that you would need to start any kind of business, which is so being persistent, because you're always going to come across obstacles and challenges. So it's working through those, being consistent as well, consistent in your approach, consistent in your image, consistent in your principles, I would say you definitely need, as well as getting things done and ticking things off your checklist, you definitely need a long-term vision and to know, where it is that you want to go, what it is you want to achieve, so that you don't lose sight of that along the line, and make sure that you align all your short-term activities to that long-term vision. And I would also say dedication to quality, and by that I mean quality of the product, but also quality in your partnerships. So that means really kind of nursing your professional relationships and your partnerships, making sure you treat everyone well, making sure that you've got regulations in place, rules in place. And finally, I would really invest in communication and networking. I think that this is often a step that that people kind of forget or leave it to last, but actually it can really drive your business forward. And basically hiring people who are smarter than you is a good one.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's pretty good advice right there. Yeah. So what would you say in terms of like what the next big thing is in coffee? If you could have a few predictions, what would they be?
So that's quite a hard question because, you know, with coffee, it's every day it changes, you know, like in the coffee publications, the headline is always, this is the next big thing. In terms of products or, you know, ways of brewing coffee or, you know, coffee varieties. So I would really answer that question in a more general way. And I would say that the next big thing in coffee is having truly sustainable supply chains. Because until now, there's been a lot of like greenwashing or social washing, I don't know how you want to call it, where people kind of you know, acknowledge that they had to be sustainable, but it was more of a like a box to tick off. I think now there's going to be, people are going to be held a lot more accountable. I think until now being sustainable has been something that's voluntary, and now we're going to start seeing real regulations in place. So people are going to be forced to examine their business practices. And you can also already see that, for example, in the EU, they have the Green Deal. And that means, you know, that people have to be fairer in the way that they trade. They have to protect the workers more. They have to be more environmentally sustainable. I think this is the main positive change that we're going to see in coffee and generally. And maybe one more thing I would say is quality for all. So until now, it's kind of been the specialty sector is the only place where you see these really high quality coffees, and they're expensive to buy and they're expensive to produce. And it's kind of been reserved to a sort of elite, you know. And I think that people are starting to see that that's just not really a sustainable business plan, because it has a very small impact. So, and you can already see, you know, big players like Lavazza or, you know, Nespresso, who are starting to invest in higher quality and more sustainable practices, but with products that are still accessible to more people. So I think that that's one thing that we'll see.
Okay, that's brilliant. So what I'm really curious to hear, are like, if you could pick 3 words to describe yourself or your philosophy on life or how you approach life, I'd really be interested to hear them.
So I'm a bit of a hustler. You know, I always have 3 or 4 projects on the go. I don't like to, you know, just invest myself in one thing. And one philosophy that I live by is never say never, because I've just found that to be true. I mean, I think it's good to have principles and to be committed to certain goals, but I think that, you know, we as human beings, we're constantly evolving. You know, our circumstances change, and, you know, so should our mindsets. So never say never. You know, you should always keep the door open for new opportunities, and kind of be humble enough to re-examine your goals and beliefs regularly. And yeah, I mean, basically, I think that both life and business strategies should be flexible. Yeah.
Okay. So where can people find out more about you and maybe get access to like your articles or keep in contact with you?
So you can check out, you can just put Sarah Charles in Perfect Daily Grinds search box and all my articles will pop up. You can also find me on the International Trade Centre's website if you search for Alliances for Action. I also dabble in videos, making videos, you know, about coffee and cocoa, and you can find those on Alliances for Action Instagram account. Everything's there. And finally, you can find me on Instagram, Sarah Chaka, SARACHAKA, and on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and that's great. I can always put some of the links in the description box anyway, just to make it be easy for people. But yeah, have you got any other last comments you want to add?
No, I mean, this is a really nice initiative, and I'm really happy to contribute in any way I can in, you know, supporting Ghana and supporting entrepreneurship and kind of anything that can change the trade narrative for the better.
Okay. Oh, that's great, Sarah. You've been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us, and yeah, for really letting us see what the industry is like on a whole. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Fiona.
Okay.